to be here with you, and nice to be here with all of you. I can't express how much of a privilege it is to get to have this session, and I cannot resist the opportunity to just reintroduce Tamar a little bit again from my perspective, which is to introduce her as really such a fundamental teacher in my life. I first met Tamar when I was a rabbinical student. And I would say from the first time that I learned from you, Tamar, just opened up for me a whole new realm of possibility of what it can mean to be a teacher of Torah and what it can mean to be a woman who studies Torah and in relationship with Torah. And that anyone who has learned with me throughout my career as a rabbi knows that I'm constantly teaching from Dirshuni. So I have like right here in my teaching spot, right, the two first and second volume, and these are in Hebrew, but the most important thing for all of you to know is that an English version, an English translation of a combination from the first two books is coming out from Brandeis. I'll find the link and we'll share the link with all of you. So you will be able to also purchase the English translation. But that these Midrashim in these books have been so powerful to me, and they really are go-to texts for me now as I teach and as I study Torah and think about the characters in the Torah. So I'm so honored to actually get to speak with you and to interview you. I want to just also start by saying anyone who's on this call, if you have learned a Dirshuni Midrash, if you've ever heard it taught or you've read it yourself, if you can like put up some, put a heart response emoji or give us a thumbs up or do something to show us just like where we've had exposure here. I know I've taught some at CST of these Midrashim, and Rabbi Avi Strasberg has as well. Beautiful. It's so wonderful to see. All right, so I want to get started, Tamar, by hearing from you. I want to hear your story, but I want to hear it through the question of, can you tell us how you came to write Midrashim yourself? How did you come to the idea that Midrash is not just something to be consumed, but something also to write? So maybe tell us a little bit about your journey and your background and how you got to that place of writing Midrashim.
So briefly, first of all, thank you. It's a miracle for me, this opportunity to be with you here. And Rabbi Avi Killip and Rabbi Avi Strasberg, I mean, you are my teachers just as well. Don't get the wrong picture. So I grew up in Beersheba, in the Negev in Israel, in the 70s and 80s. It was a desert, not just, geographically, it was also, unfortunately, quite a spiritual desert. For girls like me, that the desire to study the forbidden books, which then were forbidden, still, Talmud for girls was unacceptable. So we were very lost and frustrated. The frustration kept on for many years later. In the army, actually, I managed to convince a rabbi to come and teach us from time to time, but we were always fighting because he was very conservative and he wasn't in peace with what he's doing, so it wasn't really working well. But then when I moved to Jerusalem, the big city, and studied in Hebrew, I found out that you're allowed and it's okay, and there will be people that will teach you and will study with you. And but those years to study academically Talmud, I don't know if you went through this, it's not exactly a yeshiva kind of study, especially not existentially or emotionally. So I looked for other places, and I did study all those years in the new pluralistic batei Midrash that opened in Jerusalem and other places in Israel. But I always felt that I'm stealing somehow the study, that it's not really for me and someone will catch me, doing the wrong thing. It took me many, many years to realize that it belongs to me. And then a new crisis happened. When I finally became a scholar in Jewish studies, and I had pupils, and I was involved, and I had more confidence, I became a feminist. And I realized that all this amazing, amazing treasure of Jewish thought was written by men, for men, expressing only men's life experiences, agendas, ethics, theology. And even though I managed to find my way into the club, something was so awkward in the club. The texts themselves weren't what I was expected or needed. So it took me another at least decade to allow myself to touch, to stick my fingers into this bubbling, I don't know how to say, tub, and allow myself to write and see my writings as sacred text that will be good for Judaism and won't ruin Judaism. I'm saying this because emotionally, it's a long process to not listen anymore to people who tell you that you're destructive and you're a bad girl. It took me a long time to convince myself that I'm doing good. Still, sometimes I have these voices jumping, in the back of my mind that maybe I'm a disaster to Judaism, but thank God I'm getting these good words like Avi said before, and I realized that it's all for good. So
I'm curious, Tamar, were you a writer beforehand? Like what many people who have those kind of emotional crisis of, well, this is by men for men, just turn around and leave it all behind. Like how did you come to the idea of writing and in particular writing Midrashim as a way to add your voice?
I studied for many years in a Beit Midrash in Jerusalem, in Katamon, named Elul, Beit Midrash Elul. This is a very creative place and really support and encourage the Talmidim, the students in Beit Midrash, to do something artistic with what they're doing, with the study. But the truth is that the first Midrash I wrote, I'm telling you the secrets behind the curtains, was a Midrash that before I wrote it, I wrote a book. And I sent the book to publishers. It was a novel about three women, Goddess, Chava, and me. Mm-hmm. It was feminist theology in a novel. It was totally insane. I sent it to different publishers. They all panicked. In Israel, even today, it's too early. So instead, I just wrote a midrash, the whole point of the book in one page, and people read it and loved it and were furious with it. So I don't know. I needed to scream, and that was a way that people could hear. But I couldn't publish it in newspapers, the first Midrashim that I wrote. Nobody was willing to call it Midrash. So, that's something to do. When people reject you, just find other crazy people like you and work together. So I've noticed that this respond to this realization that the Jewish bookshelf is only by male, for male, wasn't only mine. Other feminist women realized that. It took us all at least a decade or two in the Beit Midrash to realize that all we read is by men. It takes a long time to admit it. So I found that other women were using the tools the literary tools that they learned in the batei Midrash to express themselves. I wasn't the only Michiganer. And I convinced a few women to give me their pieces. I translated a few midrashim from English that my husband showed me. And wherever I was invited to teach, whatever I was invited to teach, never mind, I would always teach some of these midrashim because I became a missionary. I saw that it's the key the key to, I don't know, it was a revelation for me that Judaism can contain Jewish sacred texts too. Jewish women can express their, I don't know, moral demands, their theology, their parshanut, the commentaries, how they see, understand, they can write mysticism. So I was really, really a missionary for truly 20 years, intense missionary of Midrashei Nashim. And as long as I gathered more and more pieces, I understood that I have more koach, more power to publish it. I went to Yediot Acharonot, which is the biggest publishing house in Israel. And I asked them to do a sacred book by women. The woman there, the editor that I turned to, the Jewish geography, small world, many years ago, she came from Jerusalem to Be'er Sheva to do a national service, and she was the leader in the youth group where I went to in Bnei Akiva, and she remembered me and my craziness, and she said, "We'll do it." So a friend of mine, Nechama, means Weingarten, that also found out this phenomena of Midrashei Nashim, and I edited for several years the first volume of Dirshuni. At some point, we lost our confidence. So many people that heard that we're doing it told us that we are ruining Judaism, that we have internalized it. And we went to Yediot Acharonot and told them that actually, let's name it a different genre. Let's invent a new genre in Judaism, and then nobody will be angry with us. They said, no, the contract was Midrash. That's the whole point. The sales will be the provocation. So we had to gather the last bits of courage, and we published the book. And as you can imagine, and it was either to hate it or to love it. People that loved it immediately started teaching it in shuls of all denominations, in different rabbinical batei Midrash, in all the pluralistic batei Midrash, in high schools. But the people who hated it all the way down, and wrote horrible book reviews, literary curses. And one rabbi in Israel published shoot, halachic shaila and answer, that says that you're not allowed to have it at home. And even though there are quotes from the Bible in it, you have to throw it to the garbage as soon as you touch it or something like that. So, there was a lot of stress around it. And what it caused eventually is like a flood of new texts that other women wrote or were willing to share.
Yeah, I want to ask a question about the first one, which is that I've always wondered, which is, did the women who wrote the first Midrashim by and large know each other and that this was a project, or each of the authors in the first version really independently came to the idea of writing Midrash and then you collected them together?
That's the fascinating phenomena, independent. I didn't know most of them. They didn't know each other. And I worked with Nechama on the first book for several years. Only after the book came out, we did like a little party. I invited everyone to one of the writers' home, and we were staring at each other, embarrassed. I knew their Midrashim by heart. From the editing process was for a long time, so I knew what are the personal stories behind the Midrashim, which is something that we'll talk about soon. But just to see their bodies, that they're also human, was heartbreaking.
Mm-hmm.
And also,
why?
They're so diverse. Some of them are secular. Some of them are very right-wing Orthodox. There was a little tragedy with one of them. She was the most right-wing. Her husband, I won't say names here, is a big rabbi in Israel. And she didn't tell him that she sent the Midrash, and he wrote a horrible book review, saying that we stole her Midrash. And because of his book review, 2 book chains in Israel are not selling Dirshuni because they believe him that we stole the piece. And the scandal, it's so Israeli. The scandal was that the conservative and reform and orthodox and secular together, it's unbearable. And that was their issue. So thank God the sales were so much better than expected. And the Yediot were happy to publish the second volume. So what's interesting is that the topics of the Midrashim are different a little bit in both volumes. And maybe I'll talk about it for a second, because what did we lack? We know that Jewish men do not think alike, right? Our Talmud is all an explosion of different thoughts about everything in the world. So what can we add? We're human before we're women. So we found out that a lot was missing, and that Jewish women do not think alike the way men do not think. So on the same topic, there will be totally different judgments, and they judge different situations and characters differently, and they relate to topics in ways that men didn't. Also, let's be honest, men wrote tons about women, but they never felt what it is to be women. So when a woman is writing a midrash about the first night, the sex in the first night, we needed that midrash. It wasn't there, and we needed it. Men cannot write about what is it to be a mother, what is it to be a daughter. They analyzed all these biblical stories from their perspective, but it's not what we experience. Not that we experience the same, anyway. So I'll just mention a few of the topics because it's fascinating. The first book was, commentary on the women in the Bible, very intense, again, judging them differently, but around them. And many midrashim that were on the Talmudic midrash or other midrashim, a midrash and a midrash, and trying to give different endings to very famous Talmudic stories. But the second book was, the women had the courage to touch more painful topics. For instance, one person in Jerusalem who was the prosecutor for sex crime in kids for many, many years, sent 3 midrashim on incest. Each of them is from her experience at work, but she puts them on different biblical stories. Fascinating things that you wouldn't think that, oh, that was the real story behind that's why this person behaved like that. And for me, it was, how did we live before that? How did we think that Judaism finished saying its moral, demands from the world before we had this midrashim? So she did that. Other person wrote 5 midrashim, witty like you can't believe, on the problem of mamzerim. I'll say it in 2 minutes because it's so extremely important. You know that Israel is just half a democracy. It's really quiet, I don't know how to say. Some of the laws in Israel are halachic rules, not rational democratic rules. For instance, in Israel, anything that has to do with getting married, divorce, and the status of kids is halachic, which means that if you have a kid that was born to incest, and of course there are, I don't know, at least 100 kids like this. I don't know how many hundreds a year are being born to incest. All these kids are considered mamzerim, or I'll explain what it means. Also, kids that were born to a woman not from her husband, which in our days, if you don't get a get after 20 years, you know that it's your last chance, and you live anyway with someone else for many years, you will have a child, especially if you're secular and you can't give a damn on halakha. But this kid, all these kids that are mamzerim, in Israeli law and halachic law cannot get married to a Jew, or in Israel at all. They can't get married. Not them. If they will get married abroad, their kids won't be able to get married in Israel forever and ever. So this person that wrote 5 Midrashim, I'm telling you, the wittiest Midrashim, on this problem, and in this Midrashim, she offers solutions. She used to be an advocate in rabbinic court in Israel, Rivka Lubitsch. She fought there for years, trying to help mamzerim, trying to help women that do not receive their get, all these horrible stories that we know. And eventually she wrote.
I'll just say, for people who have been on the journey, on the series that I taught, we learned one of Rivka's Midrashim about Tanot, who becomes an advocate. This is the same writer.
Okay. So, Avi.
I wanted to ask, I want to ask you to teach. I think maybe there's so many different questions I could say. I think maybe I'll say this just before you teach. Someone wrote into the chat the question, "What does Dirshuni mean?" So maybe we'll just start with maybe you can give obviously a translation, but also a broader, like, what does it mean to you? Why is this the title of the collection? And then we would love to hear you teach a few midrashim.
Yeah. So I'm opening, I just want to quote, Dirshuni is a word from a verse in, I forgot where I wrote about it. I think it's maybe in Amos or Malachi, I don't remember, one of the prophets that asks the people, the children of Israel, that in the words of God, Dirshuni v'chyu, that God asks us to seek for him. The word Dirshuni means seek for me, but it also means interpret me, Midrash, Dirshuni. And if you do this, you will gain life. So I couldn't believe that it appears in a pasuk, but it's there. And it's God is asking for it. It's not that we're doing a chutzpahdik wrong thing. This is the way to feel alive, and that life would, to justify life. So for me, at least, so this is like a bless. It's
yeah. Thank you. All right, you want to share some teaching with us? We'll learn a few midrashim. Okay. I think you're sharing your screen, right?
Okay, so I'll just give a tiny introduction. The midrash that I chose to learn together, Avi asked me, how is a midrash being born? So I can talk about my pieces. I know from the stories of other women that many times it's very similar. When you have a severe problem, and you feel that you're in such pain, either because the Torah is so unjust, or because your life, you have an issue that is killing you. So a midrash is a way of, like I said before, screaming about it. And this midrash that I will teach now, I don't have to say a lot about my personal life because it will be obvious from the midrash, but it has to do with the quiet problem of many women that have miscarriages, and it doesn't have room in our life, especially when it's the first pregnancy and you are sure that you'll never get pregnant again, or if it's your last, if you never make it, if you are just having them again and again, and so there's so much pain there, and there is no room really to talk about it. It's very intimate. There is something rotten in the fact that there is nowhere to talk about it, and you stay with the insecurity and the low self-esteem alone. So I learned the Mishnayot talking about the status of the halachically, what do you do after a miscarriage? Do you sit shiva? What do you do with the body, with the pieces? I don't know how to call it, the thing that fell. And it's, how shall I say it gently? You see that it's not the mother that wrote it or was a part of the committee that decided about the halachot around this. Also, it's a little bit cruel to the dads too, I think, because what they said, Chazal, they give different symbolism to the thing that fell. I don't know how to say it in English, the embryo, and they use such images.
It's a translation of the Hebrew for miscarry. The Hebrew is like a drop.
Nefel, yeah, that fell. So the images they give are so inappropriate, and it leaves you even more lonely. So I wrote this midrash that it's the only midrash in Dirshuni that relates to the divine, to God, goddess in the feminine, and ascribe her a miscarriage. And through the way she deals with it, we learn how to live with it. So I'll share with you the piece. This midrash's name is Miscarriage and Creation, and the motto, the piece that I will relate to somehow is this midrash from Kohelet Rabbah, Ecclesiastes Rabbah, and the pasuk from Ecclesiastes. He brings everything to pass precisely in its time. Do you remember this chapter in Ecclesiastes? There is time for this, there is time for that, there is time for this. So in the end of the list of how the world is working, there is this pasuk that summarizes it and says that God made it so wise that everything works on time exactly the way it should work. So what does the Midrash, the rabbinical Midrash says about it? Rabbi Abahu said that we learn from here that the Holy Blessed One was building worlds and destroying them, creating worlds and destroying them until he created these. So he uses the terms building and creating. And when I was reading this, suddenly I had this insight. I realized, oh my God, this Holy Blessed One had miscarriages until she managed to give birth to our world. And I built my midrash on this realization. So I will read it slowly and explain it. And I'm playing with this first beloved pasuk, the first of Genesis, how the world was created. At the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was tohu vavohu, darkness over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovering over the face of the waters. So I will say the word God, but you will see that she's really feminine. And God saw all her worlds falling at her feet. And she said to herself, I will just let my heart fall along with them, and I will sit in darkness like those long dead. So it means that the divine had she tried a few more times before our world, and every time these worlds fell, something was wrong, and she fell into depression. Her tears and blood were scattering in space, searching for land that would absorb them, and they wept to fragments and pieces until all of existence was the cloud and fog of the great deep. From the pasuk that the world was tehom, so all the mess that was in the world was really her blood and tears, all this mixture. And they wept to fragments and pieces until all of existence was the cloud of fog and great deep. God tried to look again at the ruins of her world and just couldn't. She covered herself with a great deep, as it's written, you made the deep, covered it as a garment, and she beat her chest and wailed, for I shall be a desolation forever. So this picture that begins the Midrash is the depressed woman with the hormones, with the blood, with the loneliness, and with the incapability of see anything out of her grief. What did she think at that moment when she could no longer bear to look on those worlds? She remembered that it is said of her, "You brought forth the earth and the world, and her womb eternal." And she felt her sons and daughters straining to be born so that they could say in gratitude, "For I was not killed in the womb." She closed her eyes, swallowed the pain lodged in her throat, and pleaded for herself that she might find more loving mercy and faith. As is written, "I declare a world of loving mercy will be built. Your faithfulness will be established in the heavens." And from that, she went and created new heavens and new earth. So God had to go through a process of hearing voices in her, and this is the way the Midrash is crazy. She hears the psukim, the verses that will be written by the much later, but we always say the rabbis always said that the Torah was before the world. So she hears these voices in her, which means the leftovers of her powers and wetness, I don't know how to say, health in her. She feels them, and she realizes that the two things that are needed to exist and to create are the loving mercy and faith. When the heavens and earth stood in wonderment and bewilderment, tohim uvohim, this is the way I doreshet. I understand the expression tohu vavohu. Usually people understand it as a mess, or I understand it tohu vavohu as a sense of bewilderment and shock and gaze of wonder. So when the heavens and earth stood in wonderment and bewilderment, she took off the garment of the deep with which she had been covering herself, and that deep of cloud and fog, her blood and tears, went and gathered into living waters. And she hovered over them back and forth, as is written, when the earth was tohu vavohu, darkness over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovering over the face of the waters. And what was she saying at that moment? That it should not totter and fall forever. And her sons and daughters joined their prayers to hers, and they themselves said that it should not totter and fall forever, that it should not totter and fall forever. Shall I read it in Hebrew too, or it's not necessary?
I think not. I think we can stick with the English. I don't know if you want to say just one word about the ending and
Sure,
what
sure.
understand it.
So in the end, maybe I'll say something at the beginning. For me, it's very, very important to learn from God how to live, because God is the one that survived the longest. So I studied feminist theology for many, many years. And I wrote my thesis on feminist theology, especially on one point. The criticism that I studied of feminist theology, criticizing the male understanding of the divine, was especially on the images of God as transcendent, from a different order, always capable to seek for, doesn't need anybody, he's not vulnerable, he's perfect. And the feminist theology was very opposed to this fantasy, because they said this is the fantasy of a male that doesn't want to be humiliated, doesn't want to be vulnerable. So they're always running in the pyramid to get to the top and not to be hurt by anyone. They will see that they have everything they need, and they won't be vulnerable like all the rest. These feminist theologians were very much influenced by feminist psychologists that said that the biggest fear of men is to be humiliated, and this is why the structures of patriarchy of psychology and theology are what they are. Never mind. What they offered instead was to talk about a God that is like us, similar to us, not perfect, vulnerable, changing, and yet has the capability to go on. This one, it's a scandal, I agree with you, but there is, as long as I'm thinking about it over the years, when I play in my mind that when I'm trying to pray to such a God or to be a friend of such a God, I see that I can be empowered by her. So in this Midrash, I try to show one example for this. This goddess knows how to, when she's hurt, she's hurt. She's not above pain. And she also learns how to notice what will give her strength and what is important in life. And I think that loving, that chesed, that mercy, that kindness, and faith in humanity, in whatever you want, but faith in the good, are things that can maybe help us go through another crisis, another loss, another horror, I don't know. So God behaves in this midrash like someone who is in such deep pain managed to find those strings in her of faith and kindness, and she is overcoming the depression and is willing to give another try, and this time she gives birth to a world that stands, but she realizes that the world is vulnerable because she knows that she herself was broken, and she prays. She's like us, she's praying, and we are like her, and we're praying together. So maybe we're not the same. She is from a different order, because I can't create the world and I can't go through all this. Even my life is hard to go through, so I don't know how she's doing, witnessing all this and still existing. But there is a common denominator, and we can learn from her. That was the purpose of this midrash.
I just, I'll say on behalf of everyone, although there's some comments in the chat, like a thank you for this midrash, and I think it's a wonderful example of the gift of Dirshuni in general and of your Midrashim in particular, Tamar, is that it's so much more than stories. Like if I was to say, oh, Tamar, she writes Midrashim, it sounds like, oh, you're giving me stories, or even if you're giving me tikkun or a correction on the stories, it's actually, like also as someone who has this shared life experience of a miscarriage, it's not only is it not a story, it's not even just something, a way to comfort and a way to process this life experience. It's actually like what I feel like the gift of this midrash is actually an opening to bring things like this to God. To say, oh, when your description of the sort of pre-feminist theology of the like God that is not this image, is that we could all just walk through the world saying, oh, God, there is no way to bring a miscarriage to God. God would never understand. God is the opposite of that. And in writing midrashim like this, you actually give us the opportunity, me and all of us who are the readers of this midrash, to like to find ways into relationship with God and to bring these things, the incest, the mamzer stories, the all of these hardest women's experiences, and actually bring those into our own relationships with God. That's what I think what makes these Midrashim so incredibly powerful, is there's real theology, but also just, pastoral implications that even you can see in the comments on this call of people saying like, I feel seen and I feel a connection from reading this Midrash that I don't otherwise have. So I want to sort of underscore that. I don't know
Maybe
if you want
I'll say that, as I said at the beginning, that Jewish women too do not feel and think the same. So just to do an overview on theology in the women's Midrashim in both volumes, it's so fascinating to see how women use different strategies to deal with the horrible, painful, big question: what is the role of God in patriarchy? Is he in charge of it? Is it all because of him? Is it because of her? Is it against God's will? And whose fault is it? Does God see the pain or doesn't understand it? And really, different women deal with totally different strategies. Some of them are fighting with God. Others ignore him and offer a world without a God. Some talk to God and convince him to see new things, and he apologizes. Others prove that God wasn't a part of this patriarchal scheme at all, and he wasn't, and he is so much against it. So just it's all playing with different verses, and Hebrew is an explosive language. The same word, you can explain the same root in opposite directions, 4 or 5 meanings. So they just the same verses are exploding into totally different meanings, and it's such a treasure. I remember just one tiny story. I remember when I was still collecting the Midrashim for the first volume, and again, I didn't know most of the women that sent the pieces. So one day I received a bunch of Midrashim by a woman. Later I saw that she's a poet. These women were, the pieces they sent were so intense, so witty, and many times so painful. So she sent pieces that were so genius. I felt it was like, like atomic bomb. 3,000 years of not talking, of not expressing, not sharing, exploded in her pieces. And I literally ran away from the room. I couldn't read it anymore. I felt like the computer is, maybe that was a revelation. I don't know what to tell you. Maybe that was my, the Torah sheyarda that came out from heaven. Her pieces were, many of them are mystical, because she's dwelled in mysticism, in Jewish mysticism. So I didn't translate them into the volume in English, but it's unbelievable. Women were there all those years, and when it comes,
Yeah. I want to invite anyone who wants to put a question in the chat. I can't promise we'll get to all of them, but now is a good time to put questions in the chat. Yeah, and I want us to do two directions. I think I just want to say one other response to this and to the comment you just made, which is that one of the things that is so powerful to me about Dirshuni is that that you're taking God and religion and Torah seriously, that it shows us a way to ask these deeper questions by going deeper and pushing further in, as opposed to running in the other direction or lightening or saying it doesn't matter, is actually just reading, as you were describing how each word can mean so many things. It's like engaging closer and deeper as opposed to a pushing away, that I think is really an incredible model, that we just don't have so much of that model. And it comes from, the depth of learning, of your learning, and also of all the other women who are these authors that have engaged so much and are just not willing to turn the other direction. And instead, like, these beautiful and amazing insights can come out of that. I want to give you an opportunity, and this Midrash that you chose, actually, you said this is the only Midrash in the collection that has female God language. But I think it's a great segue into, I would love to hear from you a little bit about your next project that you're engaged in now, that I know you've described as more radical, but I think everyone would love to hear a little bit about what is this next project, and you can tell us a little bit about what's coming out of it so far.
So, as I said, for 20 years, I did Dirshuni. I was obsessed with Midrashim. I was teaching in endless places. I felt that it will solve the Judaism existence problem. Towards the end of our years in America, we spent a decade in America. We just came back to Israel less than 2 years ago. So towards the end, a friend of mine introduced me to her friend, a woman in New York named Yael Kennerek, that used a different strategy to deal with the gap between her feminism and Judaism, her broken heart, let's say the truth. And she used a different strategy. She was so hurt by her Kabbalah teacher. She studied a lot of Kabbalah over the years. When he told her that he confessed that actually it's all male thought, and he can't help her with the feminine side of hers, that she came home and decided, okay, so I'll start everything from scratch. And the way she described it to me, she sat on the couch with her laptop and started rewriting the Bible, regendered. She did it for 5 years. She regendered the whole 5 books of Moshe. She changed all the women to men and men to women, and the God to goddess, Tehova Elohim. And then I joined her. You can imagine that it took me a long time to dare and convince my family that I won't be murdered, even though I'm not sure since we moved to Israel. And for the last 2 years, we worked intensely to do a second, third, fourth, fifth draft of these 5 books of Moshe. We regendered the scrolls, and this is another Jewish sacred book, because the Torah that we know is totally patriarchal from a male perspective, and what we offer in Torah is a totally matriarchal book, which are both the 2 ends of the book that should be written in between, or should be a combination of both the divine, the female and the male sides, and humanity, what is it to be a male and a female, and everything in between. So it offers, the project is named Torah. I'll write in the chat the website if you want to peek, because we have many texts on the website and a blog that I'm writing there. And it's a different strategy to bring Judaism to be more egalitarian, not egalitarian, more, I don't know, human, to have more voices, more dimensions, to be alive, to grow, to be wet. So it's very radical. It's not for everyone. If you don't like it and you don't feel comfortable with it, it's fine. It's only for people that really need it and can benefit from this. And I think as feminist women, we should use all strategies nonstop and find even more new strategies all the time to to see that we will be heard.
Beautiful. I think maybe, I don't know if you want to just end in the last 5 minutes by sharing with us something of like how you imagine projects like Dirshuni changing and influencing Jewish life today, you know, in that there's so much, it's like, as you've described, these Midrashim, they barely stay on the page, you know, they jump out and they grab you, or they hold you, or they, you know, they just, they're so much more than a text or a thought project. So I would just love maybe in these last 4 minutes to hear you talk a little bit about like how do they interact? What's the vision of how they might, how they are, how you're seeing them change the world, and or how they might.
Again, thank you for asking this. So when we were working on the first volume, I was sure that maybe 50 years after I die, someone will find the book and will say, oh, women actually did write Jewish sacred text. And I thought maybe it's too late for my daughters. And I was actually very pessimistic. I didn't know that what happened eventually would. So I will share with you that it's really a miracle. I don't know, Baruch Hashem, Baruch Hashem, Baruch whoever. It's Dirshuni is growing. It has life of its own that is not only under my protection. Or I thought that I taught Dirshuni obsessively because I didn't know that that people like Avi will be there and Avi Strasberg. But I started receiving the last decade emails, I promise you, from so many people in the Jewish world, either rabbis that are teaching it in their shuls, people that just learned in different places pieces of Dirshuni. And then something amazing happened. Before we left America, I was sick in bed one day, and I received an email from a woman that I knew in Boston, where we lived. And she told me, so are you coming in a few hours to the Siyum on Dirshuni? I said, what are you talking about? She said, what? Didn't they invite you? I said, who's inviting what? What's a siyum? What are we talking about?
Just tell us what a siyum is, so everyone.
Yeah, so a siyum is a party, a special party that you do when you end studying a tractate of Talmud. It's a special party because there is a special text that you are saying, and it's like saying goodbye to this tractate in Aramaic and promising it that you will come back to study it. And there's a special, and you say there's a Kaddish to say, and it's a real party. And so as I found out in that the day in the evening, JTS had a group of students with Rabbi Professor Diamond. They studied the first Dirshuni for a whole year, and they did a siyum because they related to it as limud Torah, so it was by Zoom. It was COVID already broke. And I was, lying in bed sick. I joined them. They didn't know that I'm joining them because it was lovely that they didn't invite me. It just had a life of its own. So I came from the back door, and I saw the four students teaching pieces, because in Siyum you teach the end of the tractate. So each of them taught a midrash that was very meaningful to them personally. And then they did, I start crying when I talk about it. So they did the text in Aramaic that you say to the goodbye to the tractate, and they said the Kaddish, and they said Nigunim, and I thought, I'm dying. I knew it's the peak of my life. So in the end, I raised my hand. I thought they're already going to put off everything. And I just said, can I say something? And some of them recognized me, but I guess most of them didn't. And I said, Shechiyanu, B'Shem u'B'Malchut, in Shem Hashem. I said the bracha, and I really couldn't talk. I was like crying while I was talking. And I don't know if I'll ever be in such, if I will have a zchut to be in such a, incident, I don't know how to say, makom kaze again in life. But that was a miracle for me. Since then, I'll just say that's the last sentence. I've heard of more siumim that were done on Dirshuni. So Sefaria told me that in 2-3 months, when the English Dirshuni will come out, they will put the 2 Hebrew volumes on their website, which means Dirshuni is in the Jewish bookshelf formally. Baruch Hashem.
Yay. It's a perfect way for us to end with that powerful story and with the images of people clapping. Tamar, thank you so much for this hour and for your life's work and the heart and wisdom that you offer us. We're so lucky to be living in this world where you're our teacher and putting this Torah out into the world. Truly. With that, I'll hand it back over to you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi. And we would all like to thank you once again, Tamar. This was really, really beautiful. And the Midrash that you taught earlier about building worlds and creating worlds and that process, it just really moved me. And I can see from all the comments it moved other people as well. But I was thinking about all the worlds that were personal worlds, communal worlds that were brought down because women's voices weren't heard. And so your teaching and the tears that you just shed, isn't it amazing that those tears can be out of joy and happiness? And may our world have many more tears of happiness because of learning that brings us together rather than things that push us apart. I want to thank everyone for being here today. I'd like to thank Ari again for making all this happen with CSP. And we want to thank you, all of our learners, because we can't do this without you. It's a wonderful partnership, and your interest is really, the wind in the sail. So we want to thank everyone for being here, and we look forward to seeing you really, really soon. Take care.